The ship came from the dark between stars. It was enormous, bigger than anything humanity had ever put into space. It moved slowly, deliberately, the way something moves when it knows nothing can stop it. Its hull was black and gold, carved with symbols that were older than most civilizations currently alive in the galaxy. It entered Earth's orbit without asking permission. It didn't slow down until it was ready. And when it finally stopped, it hung above the planet like a threat made visible. People on the ground stopped what they were doing and looked up at the sky, even though they couldn't see it with their eyes. They just knew it was there. News channels cut their regular programming. Schools paused their lessons. Markets stopped trading. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath at once, waiting. The ship belonged to the Vilthari Empire. Most humans had never heard that name before that morning. By the end of the day, every single person on Earth knew it. The Vilthari had ruled a large part of the galaxy for over 3,000 years. They had absorbed 43 different species into their empire, one by one, over centuries. Some of those species had fought back. Some had tried to negotiate. Some had simply surrendered the moment they saw the size of the Vilthari fleet. None of them had won. None of them had stayed free. They all ended up the same, paying tribute, following orders, and calling the Vilthari their masters. Now the Vilthari had come to Earth. Their envoy arrived in a smaller vessel that detached from the main ship and descended through the atmosphere without so much as a communication request. It landed in New Geneva, right in the middle of the United Earth diplomatic quarter, on a wide open plaza that had been quickly cleared by a very nervous security team. The landing craft touched down with a heavy metallic thud, and then a ramp extended from its side, slow and ceremonial, as if performing for an audience. Archon Sorvith walked down that ramp like he owned everything he could see. He was tall, almost 2.5 meters, with pale gray skin and 4 arms that moved in smooth, controlled gestures. His robes were deep crimson and gold, layered and formal, the kind of clothing that was designed to make the person wearing it look important and make everyone else feel small. Behind him walked 8 attendants and 2 soldiers in polished armor carrying weapons that were very clearly not decorative. Waiting for him at the base of the ramp was Secretary General Mara Vasquez, the head of the United Earth Council. She was a short woman, sharp-eyed, with dark hair pulled back neatly and a calm expression that told nothing of what she was thinking. She had been given less than 6 hours' notice that this meeting was happening. She had used those 6 hours well. She greeted Sorvith in standard galactic trade language, which humanity had been learning for the past 40 years since making first contact with smaller, friendlier alien species. She was polite. She was professional. She said it was an honor to welcome a representative of the Vilthari Empire to Earth. Sorvith did not return the pleasantries. He looked at her the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they are deciding whether or not to keep. "We will speak inside," he said. His translator rendered his words in flat, emotionless tones. The meeting took place in the Grand Council Chamber, a large circular room with high ceilings and long windows that looked out over the city. Around the central table sat the full United Earth Council, representatives from every region of the planet. They had been called in on emergency notice, and most of them had come straight from airports or emergency transport, still adjusting their clothes when they sat down. They watched Sorvith enter with careful, quiet attention. Sorvith did not sit. He stood at the head of the table, looked around the room slowly, and then placed a flat metallic tablet on the table's surface. It clicked against the wood with a sound that felt final. "This is the Imperial Tribute Decree," he said. "You will write it, you will understand it, you will comply." The decree was transmitted simultaneously to every translation terminal in the room. Council members read it in silence. The room stayed quiet, but the quality of that quiet changed as people read. It became heavier, tighter. The decree was simple and absolute. Humanity was to provide the Vilthari Empire with 30% of all resources produced by the human race, every single year, starting immediately. This included minerals, energy output, food supplies, water, and all technology that the Velthari deemed useful. Human vessels operating beyond Earth's solar system would require Velthari permits. Human colonies would be administered under Velthari law. Any resistance, any delay, any attempt to negotiate different terms would be treated as an act of aggression, and the response would be what the decree called pacification. One of the council members quietly looked up the Velthari word for pacification in the galactic database. The translation came back as orbital bombardment followed by forced integration. Sorvith let them finish reading. He seemed patient in the way that predators are patient, not because he was calm, but because he had no doubt about how this would end. "You have one galactic cycle to begin the first tribute shipment," he said. "That is 14 of your months. This is generous. Some species were given less." He said the word species, the way someone might say the word insects. Several council members looked at each other. One of them, an older man from the East Asian bloc, began to speak, started to say something about the need for discussion, about international law, about the principles of sovereignty that humanity had built its interstellar policy around. Sorvith cut him off without looking at him. "These are not points for discussion," Sorvith said. "This is a decree. It has already been decided. You are here to receive it, not to debate it." The room went very still again. Then Secretary General Vasquez, who had not spoken since the meeting began, reached forward and picked up the metallic tablet from the table. She looked at it for a moment. She read it again, slowly, from the beginning. Then she set it back down. She looked up at Sorvith directly and held his gaze without any difficulty. "We'll get back to you," she said. Her voice was quiet. It was not aggressive. It was not afraid. It was simply the voice of someone who had already started thinking 3 steps ahead. Sorvith looked at her. For just a fraction of a second, something passed across his face, not quite surprise, not quite irritation, something in between. Then he laughed. It was a short, low sound, and it was genuine. He had heard those words before. He had heard them from the Dorani, a species of large, proud warrior creatures who had said they needed time to think. They had used that time to panic and scatter. He had heard them from the Selamari, an ancient and wise people who had said they needed to consult their philosophers. Their philosophers had ultimately told them to surrender. He had heard those words, or words very much like them, from 6 different species across his career as an Imperial Archon. Every single one of them had eventually complied. He turned and walked back toward the door, his attendants falling into step behind him. 14 months, he said without turning around. "Do not waste them." His footsteps echoed across the floor and then faded as he left the building. The room sat in silence for a long moment after the sound of his ship lifting off reached them through the windows. A deep, rolling vibration that moved through the walls and the floor and the chests of everyone sitting there. Vasquez looked around the table at the faces of the council. Some were pale, some were afraid, some were angry. She studied each one carefully. Then she spoke. "Get me the joint military chiefs," she said. "Get me the heads of every major research and engineering division on the planet. Get me the colonial fleet commanders." She paused. "And get me a secure line to the intelligence directorate." She stood up from her chair. "We have 14 months, she said. "Let's not waste them." Nobody in the room laughed, but something shifted in their expressions, something that looked, if you knew where to look, a little bit like purpose. Outside, Sorvith's ship disappeared into the clouds, rising back toward the enormous vessel waiting in orbit above. He was already composing his report to the Emperor. It would say that the humans had received the decree, that they seemed appropriately subdued. That compliance, as always, was only a matter of time. He did not think about Vasquez's eyes when she said those 4 words. He probably should have. The Velthari spy network was very good. It had been perfected over centuries, refined through the subjugation of dozens of species. The Velthari knew how frightened civilizations behaved. They knew the signs, the desperate diplomatic messages sent to neighboring systems, the quiet movement of valuables off a home planet, the internal political collapses, the public protests, the quiet, exhausted acceptance that came after. They had watched it happen so many times that they had turned it into a kind of science. They knew exactly what a species looked like when it was preparing to give up. Their network watched Earth carefully after Sorvath's visit. They watched the news broadcasts, the government communications, the civilian reaction. They noted the fear. They noted the arguments in Earth's public forums, the debates, the voices saying humanity had no choice. They filed their reports. Their reports said, proceeding as expected. Their reports were completely wrong. What the Velthari network was not designed to detect, what it had never needed to detect before, was what a species looked like when it was not preparing to give up, when it was preparing for something else entirely. The mobilization of humanity happened fast, faster than anything the Velthari had ever seen from a young species, faster, honestly, than most people on Earth thought was possible. But humans had a long history of doing impossible things very quickly when the alternative was something they refused to accept. And the alternative here was very clear. The Velthari had offered humanity one choice: become a servant or be burned. Humanity, quietly and with great efficiency, chose a third option that had not been listed on the decree. 3 weeks after Sorvath's visit, the joint military chiefs met in a bunker 200 meters below the surface in an undisclosed location and began drafting what they called the Emergency Expansion Plan. It was not a defensive plan. It was not a plan about how to survive the Velthari. It was a plan about how to fight them, damage them, and make them regret the day they had ever heard the word Earth. Admiral Yusuf Akefir sat at the head of that table. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a quiet, deliberate way of speaking that made people lean in to listen. He had spent 30 years in the colonial defense fleet, mostly on long patrol routes near the outer edge of human-claimed space. He had met 4 alien species in those years. 2 of them had taught him things about how non-human minds approached conflict. He had paid close attention. He had written papers about it that very few people had bothered to read. They were reading them now. Akefir's plan centered on one core idea. The Velthari expected a conventional response. They expected humanity to either submit or try to match them ship for ship, and they knew humans couldn't do that. What they did not expect was for humanity to completely ignore conventional military thinking and build something they had never encountered, a fleet designed not to win battles, but to make every battle cost the Velthari more than it was worth. The merchant fleet was the first piece. Humanity had over 3,000 commercial vessels operating across its colonial network: cargo haulers, fuel tankers, colony transports. Akefir's team calculated that 800 of them could be structurally converted into military vessels within 8 months, not warships in the traditional sense, something faster, lighter, and harder to predict. The conversion work began within days of the plan's approval. In shipyards across 4 planets and 11 orbital stations, workers started running double shifts, then triple, then around the clock. The yards that had been building cargo vessels started building something else: hulls that were longer and narrower, engine mounts that could take military-grade drives, weapon bays that were designed to be easy to swap and upgrade, because Akefir's plan assumed, correctly, that they would be learning and changing tactics constantly throughout whatever came next. While Akefir handled the fleet, Dr. Lena Reese handled the weapons. She was not a soldier. She was a xenobiologist who had pivoted into intelligence work 8 years earlier after spending time on a mission studying the remnants of a species that had been absorbed by the Velthari 2 centuries ago. What she had found in those ruins had changed how she thought about everything. She had come back from that mission very quiet and very determined, and she had spent the years since then doing work that most people in the scientific community didn't know about. Now her team had something valuable: the physical remnants of the technology Sorvath's delegation had brought to Earth. Every ship, every device, Every piece of equipment that the Velthari had used during their visit had been scanned constantly by instruments that Vasquez's intelligence directorate had positioned throughout the diplomatic quarter before the envoy even landed. They had data, enormous amounts of it. Reese and her team worked in a facility that officially didn't exist, in a location that wasn't on any public record. They had the data, they had the best analytical minds humanity could gather, and they had a very clear sense of urgency. Within 6 weeks, they had mapped the fundamental principles of the Velthari shield system. Within 3 months, they understood it well enough to identify the exact frequencies at which it was weakest. Within 5 months, they had built a weapon system around that weakness. It wasn't a more powerful weapon, it was a smarter one, a weapon that knew exactly where to hit. Reese presented the findings to HFY with the same calm she brought to everything. She told him they could now reliably punch through Velthari's shielding with hardware that could be fitted to their converted vessels. HFY looked at the data for a long time without speaking. Then he asked her what the margin of reliability was. 91%, she said. He nodded slowly. We'll take it, he said. But perhaps the most remarkable thing that happened in those 14 months was not in the bunkers or the shipyards or the research facilities. It happened everywhere else. The public announcement had been carefully managed. Vasquez's government had not told the population everything at once. They had released information in stages, giving people time to absorb each piece before the next one came. First, the existence of the decree. Then the government's refusal to comply. Then the mobilization plan. Each announcement had been met with fear, and then with anger, and then, almost universally, with something harder and more durable than either of those things. People organized, not because they were told to, because they decided to. Factory owners retooled their production lines to build military components without being asked, presenting the conversion plans to government procurement offices before those offices had even drafted the request forms. University, engineering departments published open research on propulsion and materials, sharing everything freely, building on each other's work at a pace that the academic world had never seen before. Retired military personnel showed up at recruitment offices in numbers that overwhelmed the processing systems. Young people who had never thought about the military before found themselves filling out enlistment forms and meaning every word. There was no draft, there was no need for one. Somewhere in the psychology of humanity, formed over thousands of years of fighting amongst itself, of being backed into corners and coming out swinging, of surviving things that should have ended it, there was a response to existential threat that was not despair and not surrender. It was something more like a collective, furious decision, a settling of weight, a quiet acknowledgement that the situation was serious, followed immediately by a rolling up of sleeves. The Velthari network watched Earth throughout all of this. It filed reports. The reports noted some economic activity, some political reorganization, some military expansion, normal behavior for a threatened species. The reports said, manageable, predictable. The network was not looking for the right things. It was looking for fear, because fear was what it knew. It was not calibrated to recognize what it was actually watching, which was not a civilization falling apart under pressure. It was a civilization deciding, in every city and shipyard and laboratory on 4 planets and 11 stations, exactly who it was. 8 months into the 14-month window, HFY visited one of the converted shipyards in person. He walked the length of one of the new vessels, long and lean, its hull still unpainted, smelling of metal and sealant and fresh welding. Workers nodded at him as he passed. None of them stopped working. He put his hand on the hull near the bow, feeling the faint vibration of the systems being tested inside. The ship didn't have a name yet, it would get one. They all would. He stood there for a moment, thinking about Sorvath's laugh in the council chamber. That short, genuine, dismissive sound. Then he walked back to his transport. There was more work to do, and time was not unlimited. But for the first time since this had started, something in his chest felt settled. He didn't know if humanity was going to win what was coming. Nobody could know that yet. But he knew, in the way that he knew things after 30 years of reading conflict, that the Velthari had made a mistake. Not a small, correctable mistake. The kind that changed things permanently. They had assumed that young meant helpless. They had confused inexperience with weakness. They had looked at humanity and seen a species that hadn't been tested yet, and they had thought that meant the test would be easy. They had not considered the possibility that something untested might turn out to be, when the moment came, extraordinary. The ship behind him hummed quietly in the dark of the shipyard, almost like it was breathing, getting ready. The 14th month arrived like any other month. The sun rose over New Geneva the same way it always did. People went to work. Children went to school. The city moved and breathed and made its familiar sounds. Anyone watching from the outside might have thought it was an ordinary morning on an ordinary day. But underneath that surface calm, spread across 4 planets and the cold black space between them, something was in position and waiting. It had been waiting for 3 days. On the bridge of the Velthari command vessel Eternal Dominion, Archon Sorvith stood before the main viewing screen and watched the blue and white curve of the Earth below. He had returned to Earth's orbit 1 day before the deadline, which was standard procedure. It was a reminder, a visual pressure. It had worked many times before. The sight of an Imperial vessel hanging above a planet had a way of clarifying the thinking of the people below. His communication officer informed him that the deadline had officially passed. Sorvith nodded. He straightened his robes. He had prepared a short address, the formal acceptance of tribute speech, or, if necessary, the preliminary bombardment declaration. He had given both many times. He almost hoped it would be the bombardment one. These humans had made him wait longer than most, and there was something about the way that woman had looked at him that had quietly irritated him for 14 months. "Open a channel to the United Earth Council," he said. The channel opened, but what appeared on his screen was not a live feed of frightened council members. It was a recorded message, pre-prepared, already waiting for him. The screen showed Secretary General Mara Vasquez. She was standing, not sitting. She was not wearing diplomatic clothing. She wore a dark uniform, the uniform of the United Earth Armed Forces, and her posture was straight and still. Behind her, through a large window, the skyline of New Geneva was visible in morning light. She looked directly at the camera, at him. "Archon Sorvith," she said. Her voice was even, measured. "The United Earth Council has reviewed the Imperial Tribute Decree. We have considered it carefully. We have discussed it at every level of our government and with every part of our population." She paused for exactly 1 second. "Our answer is no." Sorvith's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't move. "Humanity does not pay tribute," she continued. "Not to you, not to anyone. We understand what you are. We understand what you have done to 43 other peoples across this galaxy. We have studied your history, your methods, and your technology for 14 months, and we want you to know something." She leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "We were paying attention." She let that sit for a moment. "You came to our world and placed a decree on our table and expected us to fold, because every species you have ever approached has eventually folded. We are not every species. We have spent the last 14 months making sure you understand that." On the screen, she picked up a small remote and pressed a button. "This message was recorded 12 hours ago," she said. "By the time you watch it, you will already know what I mean. I hope you survive long enough to deliver our terms to your Emperor. Vasquez out." The message ended. Sorvith stared at the blank screen. Then he turned to his tactical officer. "What is she?" The tactical console lit up all at once. Every sensor on the Eternal Dominion screamed at the same time. The sound filled the bridge, a sharp, layered chorus of proximity alerts, threat identifications, weapons locks. His tactical officer's face went from professional calm to something that looked very much like pure shock in the space of 2 seconds. "Contact," the officer said. His voice was strained. "Multiple contacts, bearing all directions. They are—" He stopped, started again. "Sir, there are vessels surrounding us. Human vessels. 467 confirmed contacts. They have been running in full stealth configuration and they are already inside our defensive perimeter." Sorvith moved to the tactical screen himself. He looked at it. He looked at the shape of what was displayed there. His fleet, his 8 escort vessels and the Eternal Dominion, surrounded completely on all sides by a web of human warships that had apparently been sitting there, invisible and silent, for days. He had been orbiting above the Earth for 24 hours. Those ships had been around him that entire time. He felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. His hands, hidden inside the folds of his robe, were absolutely still. That was not calm. That was a man who had been trained for decades in the management of difficult situations, forcing himself not to show what was happening in his chest. "Battle stations," he said quietly. "Shields to maximum, prepare weapons." He had barely finished speaking when one of his escort captains, a younger officer on a smaller vessel, probably scared, probably making the worst decision of his life, fired. A single beam weapon discharge, directed at the nearest human ship. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the human fleet responded. Later, when the battle records were analyzed and studied and eventually taught in military academies across a dozen different worlds, the consensus was that calling it a battle was somewhat generous. It lasted 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, all 8 of Sorvith's escort vessels were disabled or destroyed. The Eternal Dominion itself took 23 direct hits, all of them surgically placed, all of them at the exact harmonic frequencies that corresponded to the ship's shield weaknesses, because Dr. Reese's work was very good indeed. The great flagship of the Velthari Regional Fleet, a vessel that had participated in the subjugation of 11 species and had never in its entire service history sustained serious damage in combat, went dark. Its engines stopped. Its weapons went offline. Its shields collapsed. It drifted, enormous and silent like a very expensive piece of debris. Then the boarding pods came. They were fast and they were precise. Human soldiers in full combat gear, trained for close-quarters operations in pressurized environments, moved through the Eternal Dominion with the kind of efficiency that comes from 14 months of doing nothing but preparing for exactly this moment. They secured the bridge within 4 minutes. They secured the engineering deck in 6. There was resistance. Of course there was. But the Velthari crew had not been trained to defend against a boarding action, because no species had ever gotten close enough to attempt one. Sorvith was on the bridge when the human soldiers reached it. He was standing upright, still in his crimson and gold robes, 4 arms at his sides. He had not reached for a weapon. He was not a man who made useless gestures. The soldier who entered first was a young woman in dark armor. She removed her helmet as she crossed the threshold. She had the kind of face that had been awake for 30 hours and was running entirely on purpose. She looked at Sorvith without hostility and without fear. "Archon Sorvith," she said in clear trade language, "you are not going to be harmed. We have medical staff standing by for any injured crew. Your vessel will be secured but not destroyed." She held his gaze. "You are going to go home." Sorvith said nothing for a moment. He looked around his bridge, at the dark screens, the offline systems, the soldiers standing at each station, at the whole extraordinary reality of what had just happened. "Why are you keeping me alive?" he asked. His voice was steady. He was, whatever else he was, a professional. The soldier looked at him directly. "Because you're a messenger," she said. She said it without drama, without performance, just as a simple, factual answer, the same way you might tell someone what time it was. Sorvith understood immediately. They didn't want a trophy. They didn't want a public execution or a dramatic gesture of dominance. They were sending him back to the Emperor. They were sending him back to tell the story of what had happened here, of 11 minutes in orbit above a small blue world, so that the people who made decisions at the top of the greatest empire in this part of the galaxy would know exactly what they were dealing with before they decided what to do next. It was, he had to admit, more strategically intelligent than anything he had expected from them. He was transferred to a human vessel. He was given quarters. He was given food. They had actually researched what Velthari ate, and he was left alone, which he was grateful for. He sat in that small room as the human vessel moved away from Earth and the Eternal Dominion was taken under tow, and he thought about many things. He thought about the Secretary General's expression in that council chamber 14 months ago when he had laughed. He thought about how she had set the decree back on the table and looked at him as if she had already made her decision and was simply waiting for the appropriate time to act on it. He thought about the fact that those 467 ships had been in position around his fleet for 3 days. 3 days of silence, of patience, of waiting for the right moment. He thought about what kind of species could organize something like that, could keep every single one of those crews absolutely still and invisible for 72 hours, knowing that the slightest noise or power reading might give them away. He thought about the word patient. He thought about how he had always associated patience with weakness, with hesitation, with doubt, with the slow, uncertain movements of species that didn't have the confidence to act. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about that. He was the messenger, and he had a message to carry. And the message was this: humanity had been given 14 months and a threat. They had taken the 14 months and turned them into something that the Velthari Empire, in 3,000 years of expansion and conquest, had never seen before. They had turned the time into readiness. They had turned the threat into a reason. Outside the small window of his quarters, the stars moved slowly past. Somewhere among them was the Imperial Throne World, and the Emperor, and a conversation that Sorvith was not looking forward to having. He straightened his robes out of habit. He had a long journey ahead. News traveled fast across the galaxy, not as fast as light, but fast enough. Within 3 standard weeks of the Battle of Earth's orbit, which was what people were already calling those 11 minutes, the story had reached every major system in the known galactic community. Quantum relay stations passed it along through the network, and the signal jumped from station to station until it had touched the communications hubs of dozens of worlds, dozens of governments, dozens of species who had been living under the Velthari Empire, or in the Empire's shadow for as long as anyone could remember. The story was simple. A young species had told the Velthari no, and then they had proven they meant it. Most of the galaxy didn't believe it the first time they heard it. Then they saw the sensor data, the battle logs, the footage of the Eternal Dominion going dark. They reviewed the numbers: 8 escort vessels against 467 human ships, 11 minutes one-sided, and they still had trouble accepting it as real. Because the thing that made it extraordinary was not just the outcome. It was how it had been done, the preparation, the patience. The way the humans had already been in position when the deadline arrived, as if the act of responding to the threat had started the moment the threat was made. Across 14 subjugated worlds, in quiet rooms and in whispered conversations, people who had long ago stopped thinking the word free said it again for the first time in a long while. Quietly at first, carefully, but they said it. The Emperor of the Velthari did not take the news calmly. He ordered a response within 48 hours of Sorvith's return. Not a punitive mission, not a demonstration. A full Imperial war fleet, 4,000 vessels drawn from multiple regional commands, tasked with one objective: find humanity's ships, destroy them, then reduce every human-inhabited world to ash. He wanted it done completely and without any possibility of the story continuing. He wanted it done so absolutely that the idea of saying no to the Velthari Empire would be destroyed along with the species that had dared to do it. The fleet was assembled in 6 weeks and sent toward human space. It arrived to find nothing where it expected an enemy to be. Humanity's fleet had moved, all of it, when HFY had received intelligence passed along, interestingly, through a source he would not officially identify until years later, about the approximate size and direction of the Imperial response. He had pulled every ship out of the obvious positions and scattered them. Not retreated, not hidden, dispersed. There was a difference, and it was important. The Velthari fleet moved through the outer edge of human colonial space, enormous and furious, sweeping in formation, looking for something to hit. They found empty patrol routes and abandoned sensor stations. They found one small mining platform staffed by 6 maintenance drones, which they destroyed very thoroughly. They moved further in, toward the inner colonies. HFY let them come. While the main Velthari fleet was pushing forward looking for a front line to fight, small groups of human ships, fast, light, difficult to track, were doing something else entirely. They were hitting the places the Imperial fleet had passed through: supply depots, refueling stations, communication relay posts, the long, thin chain of logistics infrastructure that an army of 4,000 vessels depended on to keep moving and fighting. The Velthari fleet pushed deeper into human space. Behind them, their supply line was being taken apart piece by piece. The first sign that something was wrong came when a Velthari resupply convoy failed to arrive on schedule. Then a second one. The fleet slowed, waiting for the convoys, and while it waited, human ships hit 3 of its rearguard vessels in a coordinated ambush that lasted 4 minutes and left all 3 disabled before the fleet could mount a proper response. When the response came, the human ships were already gone, dispersed back into the dark between stars. The Velthari commander, a war veteran named High Admiral Dren Kaz, recognized what was happening faster than most of his officers would have. He had fought insurgent campaigns before, in the early stages of several subjugations. He knew what asymmetric resistance looked like. He adjusted his fleet's formation, spread his patrol coverage, tried to secure the supply routes. HFY adjusted within a week. This was the part of the war that the galaxy watched most closely, because it was unlike anything that had happened in recorded galactic history. Not the battles individually. Each one was small, tactical, often inconclusive, but the pattern of them together. The way humanity seemed to be running a completely different kind of war than the one the Velthari thought they were fighting. Every time the Imperial fleet adapted, the human response changed. Every time the Velthari thought they had found the pattern, it shifted. HFY had a philosophy about this that he explained once briefly to a junior officer who asked him about it. He said, "We are not trying to win battles. We are trying to make each battle cost them more than they expected to pay. We keep doing that until the cost becomes unacceptable." The junior officer asked, "How do you know when the cost is unacceptable?" HFY said, "They'll tell us." Meanwhile, Dr. Reese was running a different kind of operation. Her team had spent the years before the war studying the remnants of Velthari technology, and now they had something much more useful: active access to captured Velthari vessels. The 300 ships taken intact during various engagements in the first year of the war were a gold mine of information. Her team went through every system, every database, every piece of software they could access. They found the Velthari AI core architecture. They found the communication encryption keys for 3 regional commands. They found something else that Reese kept very quiet for a long time: a dormant biological payload system that the Velthari had developed for use against resistant populations. It was designed to disable, not kill. It affected a specific set of neural transmitter receptors that were common to Velthari biology. Reese reprogrammed it. She gave it a new target, not neurons, but the quantum processing cores that ran Velthari's ship AI systems. She packaged it into a transmission format that looked like a routine software update ping. In the 15th month of the war, the reprogrammed payload was transmitted on a captured Velthari encryption channel during a lull in one of the mid-zone engagements. 312 Velthari vessels in a regional fleet received what their systems identified as a standard maintenance update. Their AI cores downloaded it without hesitation. 4 hours later, the AI cores in all 312 ships simultaneously ran a process that they couldn't stop and couldn't reverse, and shut themselves down. Not the ships, not the crew systems, not life support or propulsion, just the AI cores, the systems that managed tactical coordination, weapons targeting, and fleet formation synchronization. 312 Velthari warships, in the middle of an active war zone, suddenly became very large, very expensive vessels that could still move and breathe but could no longer fight as a coordinated unit. Their crews were unharmed. Their weapons were physically intact, but without the AI coordination systems, their targeting was limited to manual operations, their communication encryption was broken, and their formation cohesion collapsed. Human boarding teams arrived within 90 minutes. The ships were taken without a single casualty on either side. HFY had told Reese, when she briefed him on the plan, that it was the most elegant thing he had ever seen. She told him it was just biology applied to engineering. He said that was also an elegant way to describe it. The captured fleet became a turning point. The Velthari had entered this war with 4,000 ships. After 2 years of the HFY doctrine and the loss of over 600 vessels to combat and capture, they had 3,300. The numbers still favored them, but numbers were not the thing that was changing the war. What was changing the war was a word that began appearing in Velthari intelligence reports and eventually made its way into the private notes of High Admiral Kaz himself. The word was Dresha. It was an old word from early Velthari military history, used to describe opponents who modified their tactics so quickly and completely in response to combat information that they seemed almost to predict what you were going to do before you did it. The Velthari had coined the word several thousand years ago. They had never needed to use it since. Most species, when they fought the Velthari, tried to fight them the way the Velthari expected to be fought. Humans did not do this. Humans looked at each engagement, found what had failed, discarded it immediately, and tried something new. They failed in new ways constantly and improved constantly at the same rate. Their failure and their learning were the same process. It was, to Velthari military minds trained to rely on proven doctrine and established formation strategy, genuinely disorienting. In the 3rd year of the war, 14 subjugated species began providing intelligence to humanity's networks. Not fighting, they were still too afraid for that, centuries of imperial rule having worn the sharpness of resistance out of them. But information, fleet movements, supply schedules, communication codes, the location of imperial strategic assets. They passed it carefully, secretly, through channels that wouldn't be noticed, because they were watching what the humans were doing, and they had begun to feel something they hadn't felt in a very long time. Something that felt like hope. Admiral HFY received the intelligence from those sources with deep gratitude and said nothing publicly about where it came from. He protected those channels carefully. He understood what it meant for a broken people to take even a small step back toward something like defiance, how much courage it required, and how fragile that courage was, and how important it was not to get them killed. He used the information well. By the end of the 3rd year, the Velthari had suffered losses that their treasury was beginning to notice, and their generals were no longer able to explain away. In 3,000 years of empire, they had never fought a war that lasted this long against a single opponent. They had never needed to send multiple resupply fleets, replace multiple regional commanders, redesign their tactical doctrine 3 times in a row. High Admiral Kaz sent a private message to the imperial throne world. In it, he laid out the numbers with brutal honesty. He said what the numbers meant. He used the word that no Velthari general had ever used in a report to the emperor before. He recommended negotiation. The emperor read the message twice. He put it down. He looked out the window of his throne chamber at the perfectly maintained gardens below, which had been growing in that configuration for 1,000 years, which were a symbol of order and permanence and the long reach of imperial authority over everything that fell within it. He picked the message up and read it a third time. Then he sent back a single word. It was not the word Kaz had hoped for, but it was a word that would change before long, because Kaz was right, and the emperor knew it, and the garden outside the window was not going to change what the numbers said. In human space, far away, Admiral Akafor read the latest intelligence summary and then went to get coffee, because he had been awake for 22 hours and the war was not done yet, and he was the kind of man who understood that the last stretch of a hard thing was often the hardest part. He drank his coffee standing up, looking at the star map. He thought about the 14 subjugated species quietly passing information through hidden channels. He thought about what it would mean for them if humanity won. He thought about what it would mean if humanity lost. He set down his cup and went back to work. The request came quietly, the way all the most significant things do. It arrived through a neutral communications relay, one of the old galactic trade network hubs that even the war had left untouched, because both sides needed the relay stations for other purposes, and neither had been willing to destroy something that useful. The message was short and written in formal Velthari diplomatic script. It was addressed to the United Earth Council. It requested the opening of peace negotiations at a location of humanity's choosing. Vasquez read it 3 times. Then she sent it to Akafor and Reese and the full council. She gave them an hour to respond. They all said yes. There was no celebration of the message's arrival. No speeches, no public announcement, no ceremony. There was a quiet acknowledgement within the inner circle of humanity's government that the war was moving into its final phase, and then people went back to work, because the final phase of a hard thing required more careful attention than any other part. The location humanity chose was not the imperial throne world, and it was not Earth. It was a neutral station, an old trading post in the space between empires, used for centuries by independent merchants and small species who couldn't afford allegiances. It was not grand. It was functional and a little worn, and its meeting rooms smelled faintly of recycled air and the particular staleness of a place that had seen too many difficult conversations. Vasquez took 3 people with her, just 3. Not a military escort, not a diplomatic team of 40 advisors. 3 people. Her chief translator, her legal architect, the woman who had written the terms, and a young aide named Davy who had been with her since before any of this started, and who, when asked why he was included on the delegation, was told by Vasquez that someone needed to take notes and she trusted his handwriting. They arrived in an unarmed shuttle. No weapons, no escort ships waiting at a safe distance. An unarmed shuttle docking at a neutral station, carrying a head of government and 2 specialists and a young man with good handwriting. The Velthari delegation was waiting when they arrived. High Admiral Kaz was there, along with senior diplomatic representatives of the imperial court and a security team that was large enough to be noticed. They looked at the human delegation size, 4 people, no weapons, and something in Kaz's expression shifted. He was a military man. He understood the gesture immediately. He understood what it said. We could have sent a fleet. We chose not to, remember that. Vasquez greeted Kaz with a nod that was respectful without being deferential. She took her seat at the table without ceremony and placed a single document in front of her. She looked around the room at the Velthari representatives and then spoke in trade language, clearly and without preamble. We are here to end this, she said. Not to humiliate you, not to make demands that are impossible to meet, but the terms are fixed. They are not a starting point for negotiation. They are what they are. Kaz said, "We understand." His tone was not warm, but it was honest, and Vasquez had learned by now to appreciate honesty in all its forms. The terms were presented by the legal architect, a calm, precise woman named Dr. Asham Meridian, and they were exactly as the inner council had agreed upon. They were not written in anger. They had been written by people who were exhausted from 3 years of war and who understood that the goal was not punishment but permanent change. The first term was full sovereign recognition of all peoples under Velthari dominion, not a gradual process, not a transitional period, not a managed independence with continued imperial oversight. Full sovereignty, immediate and unconditional, for every species that the Velthari had absorbed. They could choose their own governments, their own laws, their own futures. The empire could maintain trade relationships with them if those relationships were freely chosen. It could not maintain administrative control. The Velthari representatives argued on this point for most of the first day. They said it would destabilize the galactic economy. They said some of those species were not ready for self-governance. They said the process needed time. Meridian listened to all of it and then explained, without raising her voice, that the term was fixed. The argument continued. The term did not change. By the second morning, the Velthari side had stopped arguing about the first term. The second term was reparations, not resources, not territory, not money. Humanity wanted 3,000 years of Velthari scientific records, the accumulated research and development of the oldest continuously operating civilization in this part of the galaxy. Medicine, physics, materials, science, agriculture, engineering, biology. All of it transferred in full, freely, and completely to the United Earth Council. This surprised the Velthari delegation more than any other term. They had expected something punitive: resource demands, military restrictions, territorial concessions. They had prepared arguments for all of those things. They had not prepared for someone to ask for their library. Vasquez explained it herself briefly. She said humanity wasn't interested in taking things from the Velthari. She said they were interested in a galaxy that worked better than it had been working. 3,000 years of science, distributed freely through the newly independent worlds and through humanity's own research networks, would do more lasting good than any number of resource payments. The Velthari representatives conferred privately for a long time. When they came back, they agreed. The third term was the Galactic Compact, a mutual framework for trade, non-aggression, and dispute resolution, open to every independent species in the known galaxy. No single empire would administer it. No single species would have veto power within it. It would be governed by a council of representatives from every member world, each with one equal voice. The Velthari could join if they chose to. They would not lead it. Kaz looked at this term for a long time without speaking. He was a man who had spent his entire career in service of an empire that had built its identity on being larger and older and more powerful than everything around it. He understood what it meant to agree to a framework where his civilization sat at the same table as species it had owned. He understood what it cost. He signed anyway, because he was smart enough to understand that the alternative was worse and honest enough to admit it. The fourth and final term was the one that had been Vasquez's own idea, added to the list on the last night before she had left for the station. The legal team had questioned it. It seemed small compared to the others. She had insisted. The original tribute decree, the flat metallic tablet that Sorvith had placed on the table in New Geneva, was to be returned to Earth, framed, and placed in the United Earth Council Museum in New Geneva. A permanent exhibit, open to the public, accompanied by the full documented history of what had followed it. Not as a weapon, not as a trophy of humiliation, as a reminder, as an answer permanently displayed to the question, what do you do when someone places a demand like this in front of you and laughs? The Velthari side did not argue about this term. They seemed to understand it. The signing took place on the morning of the third day. It was quiet. There were no cameras, both sides had agreed to that. The document was signed by Vasquez and Kaz and the senior imperial diplomatic representative, and then witnessed by the station's neutral administrator, a small gray-furred creature named something that translated roughly as keeper of records, who had run this station for 40 years, and who would later say, in a memoir that became widely read across 36 worlds, that it was the strangest and most important thing he had ever seen in his life. When it was done, Kaz looked at Vasquez across the table. "You should know," he said, "that many in the Empire did not think this was possible, that you could do this." Vasquez held his gaze. "I know," she said. "They were wrong," he said. "Yes," she said simply, "they were." There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable, just real. Then the delegations packed up their things and went back to their respective ships. On Earth, when the news of the signing reached the planet, carried on civilian broadcasts this time, not through military channels, the reaction was not what some people expected. There were celebrations, yes, in the streets of New Geneva and in the colony cities on Mars and on the outer worlds. Music and lights and people who had been carrying 3 years of tension in their bodies finally letting it go in the open air. But for many people it was quieter than that, more personal. Families who had someone in the fleet sent messages they had been holding back. Workers in the converted factories sat down and felt the weight of what they had been carrying for 3 years settle and begin to lift. People who had signed up without being drafted, who had retooled their businesses without being asked, who had shared their research without being compelled to, they felt something that was not pride exactly, but was related to it. Something that came from having been part of a collective choice, and from that choice having meant something. Vasquez was back on Earth by the time the news went public. She stood at the window of the United Earth Council chamber, the same window, the same room where Sorvith had laughed 18 months before the war started, where she had told him they would get back to him. A junior aide appeared at the door. He was young, 20-something, and he had the kind of face that had grown up during the war and was still figuring out what peace looked like. "Secretary General," he said, "the celebration broadcasts are asking if you have a statement." She didn't turn from the window. Outside, cargo ships were rising from the launch pads beyond the city, heading upward, the same as they did every day. But these ones were loaded differently. Medical supplies, agricultural equipment, engineers with tools and expertise, heading for newly independent worlds that were going to need a great deal of help figuring out how to stand on their own after centuries of being told they couldn't. "What should humanity do now?" he asked, "now that the galaxy knows who we are?" She turned from the window and looked at him. "What we always do," she said. "We show up, we help, we build things, we make sure the people we can reach are better off than they were before we got there." She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. "And we make sure nobody forgets," she said, "what it cost to get here." She walked past him toward the door. Behind her, through the tall windows, the cargo ships climbed steadily into a clear sky, heading out into a galaxy that was not the same one it had been 4 years ago. In a museum in New Geneva, in a case that would be installed in the coming weeks, a flat metallic tablet would sit behind glass with a small printed card beside it. The card would say what the object was. It would say when it had arrived and who had brought it. And it would say, in simple language that any visitor, young or old from any world, could understand what humanity had done when it was placed on the table. Not submitted. Not begged. Not despaired. Decided. And far across the galaxy, on 14 worlds that were still learning what it meant to be free again, people were having conversations they hadn't been allowed to have for a very long time, making plans, arguing about their futures, choosing their own leaders and writing their own laws and planting crops for harvests that would belong to them and no one else. They were doing it because humanity had shown them it was possible. And humanity had shown them it was possible not by being the biggest or the oldest or the most powerful thing in the galaxy. But by being, when the moment came, absolutely unwilling to accept that the moment was anything other than theirs to decide. That was the tribute humanity paid, not to an empire, to the idea that some things are worth everything.